The day my parents announced the succession plan, I realized I didn't exist in their future anymore. My name is Riley Quinn, the youngest daughter in a family where tradition was treated like law. My father built his own law firm from the ground up. My mother managed the household like an extension of that office, and my sister followed his path so perfectly it almost felt rehearsed. That afternoon, we sat in the conference room of the firm. My father called it a family succession meeting. The table was lined with documents already stamped and signed. Every property, every share, every account had been transferred entirely to my sister. My name was nowhere. I tried to steady my voice and asked, "Is there a mistake?" My father's eyes stayed fixed on the papers as he said calmly, "You get nothing." There was no explanation, no hesitation, only those words filling the room. My mother looked down silent. My sister didn't even flinch. The decision had already been made long before I walked in. The quiet that followed wasn't peace. It was the sound of a door closing for good. I stood up, nodded once, and left before my voice could shake. Outside, rain blurred the city lights as I walked toward the parking lot. I remembered the night I told them I wanted to write code instead of becoming a lawyer. That was the night I stopped belonging to this family. Staring up at the glowing sign of the firm, I whispered, "If they gave me nothing, I'll build everything myself." I never knew that the day they said, "You get nothing," would become the day I gained everything. If you've ever been dismissed for choosing your own path, stay until the end. This story might just be yours. 3 months before that day, everything still felt normal. My father, Richard Quinn, was the founder of Quinn and Associates, a law firm that had become the pride of our small city. He was known for his precision, his discipline, and his belief that success could be inherited like a family heirloom. My mother, Eleanor, managed the firm's finances and our household with the same quiet authority, balancing both worlds as if they were one. My sister, Lydia, embodied everything they valued. She had perfect posture, perfect timing, and a future that already seemed written for her. She dressed like my mother and spoke like my father, and at every dinner the conversation would find its way back to her latest achievements. The pride in their voices felt like applause. I was proud of her too, though sometimes that pride felt heavy. Riley, was the quiet one in the corner, typing on an old laptop that wheezed each time I turned it on. While my family discussed clients and case files, I wrote small programs building invisible worlds of logic and color. It wasn't glamorous, but it made me feel alive. I loved how lines of code could turn into something functional, something mine. It felt like creating order in a place where I had none. One evening at dinner, the air smelled of rosemary and the faint bitterness of wine. My father asked about my plans for college. His tone was polite but expectant, the kind of question that wasn't really a question at all. Lydia jumped in first, sharing how she had been offered an internship through one of his senior partners. My mother's eyes shone as she reached across the table to touch her hand, already imagining the framed diploma that would soon hang beside my father's. When the conversation turned to me, I could feel the weight of every stare. I took a breath and said I had decided to study software engineering. I told them I wanted to build something on my own, maybe develop applications that could change how people lived and worked. For a moment, no one spoke. The sound of the clock ticking filled the silence. My father placed his fork down slowly, his expression unreadable. My mother looked at her plate as though the food had suddenly lost its taste. Lydia's smile froze. Then my father said in a voice calm but colder than I had ever heard, "If you walk away from law, don't expect anything from me." The words didn't echo, but they stayed in the air, heavy and irreversible. I felt a quiet ache rising in my chest, the kind that doesn't break you instantly, but hollows you out piece by piece. I didn't argue, didn't beg. I knew that arguing would only make the wall higher. I nodded quietly, understanding that this was the moment everything changed. After dinner, I went to my room and began packing. I didn't own much that mattered, just a few clothes, my laptop, and a notebook filled with half-finished code. I slipped an old family photo between the pages, not because it made me feel safe, but because I needed to remember what I was walking away from. When I stepped outside, the night air felt unfamiliar, sharp with freedom and fear. The lights from our house glowed behind me, steady and distant. I didn't look back. Somewhere in that quiet street with nothing but a bag and a dream, I decided that losing everything they promised might be the only way to find myself. 6 months later, I was sharing a one-bedroom apartment with two strangers. The place was cramped with a flickering kitchen light and a heater that worked only when it wanted to. Still, it was mine in a way my parents' house had never been. I worked as a barista at a coffee shop 2 blocks away, pulling espresso shots for students and office workers who looked through me as if I were invisible. The pay barely covered my half of the rent, but it was enough to keep the lights on and buy instant noodles. Every morning before sunrise, I would open the cafe wipe tables and practice small talk I never used. Then after my shift, I walked to the library to study programming. My laptop was slow, my eyes always tired, but coding gave me something steady when everything else was uncertain. I taught myself JavaScript, Python, and a little bit of design learning from free tutorials and online forums. My savings melted away faster than I expected. Rent, food, transportation, all of it chipped away at what little I had left. The only luxury I refused to give up was internet access. Without it, I was cut off from the world I was trying to enter. I lived on cheap coffee and quiet determination. One rainy evening when the cafe was about to close, a familiar voice called my name. I turned to see my Aunt Diane, my father's younger sister. She had once been a software engineer before leaving the corporate world to start her own tech consultancy. Unlike the rest of my family, she had always spoken to me like I mattered. We sat down after closing, and she listened while I told her about my work, my studies, and how I was barely staying afloat. Diane smiled and said, "If you're serious about coding, come to my co-working space tomorrow. There's an empty desk next to mine." The next day, I went. Her office was filled with quiet hums of computers, walls lined with whiteboards, and the smell of strong coffee. It felt alive. For the first time in months, I felt seen again. Diane didn't give me money or pity, just space and Wi-Fi. I began spending every spare moment there, building something of my own, a mobile app called HomeEase. It was simple, an app that connected homeowners with local repair freelancers. I wanted it to make everyday problems easier, like finding someone to fix a leaking pipe without endless calls. The idea came from my own struggles living in that apartment where everything broke. Weeks passed, and my routine became a rhythm: work, code, sleep, repeat. Each night, I watched the app take shape on my screen, like watching a fragile dream grow muscle. When it finally worked, I submitted HomeEase to a startup competition in Boulder. I didn't expect much. It felt like sending a message in a bottle into the ocean. One morning, while steaming milk at the cafe, my phone buzzed with an email notification. I wiped my hands, unlocked the screen, and read, "You've been shortlisted for the final round." My hands trembled. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I reread the message 3 times, afraid it might vanish. I looked around the cafe at the noisy customers, the espresso machine hissing like a small engine, and felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. That summer, everything started changing. The air in Boulder felt brighter, charged with the energy of possibility. The startup competition had opened a door I never imagined could be mine. During one of the networking sessions, my aunt introduced me to her longtime friend, Alan Brooks, a local investor known for helping small tech founders get their first real start. Alan was in his early 50s with a patient smile and the kind of confidence that came from decades of watching ideas rise and collapse. When Diane told him about my app, he listened carefully, asked questions I couldn't answer immediately, and then said, "Let's meet next week. I want to see what you've built." That single meeting changed the rhythm of my life. Alan sat beside me as I presented HomeEase on my old laptop, the interface still rough but functional. He didn't seem to notice the flaws. Instead, he looked at the code and said, "There's something honest about this. You built it to solve a real problem." He offered to mentor me and help fund the early development in exchange for a small share of the project. I accepted without hesitation. From that day, my world turned into a cycle of coffee code and exhaustion. Alan met with me twice a week at the co-working space to review progress, while Diane kept reminding me to eat something that wasn't instant noodles. With their guidance, I began improving the user experience, making it more intuitive and accessible. I reworked the color palette, redesigned the onboarding screens, and wrote new lines of code until dawn. My hands hurt from typing, but every small improvement made the app feel closer to what I had always imagined. Alan was firm but fair. When I rushed through explanations, he stopped me and said, "Take your time. Precision will save you later." He treated me not as a charity case, but as someone capable of building something meaningful. Diane's advice was different, softer but sharper in its truth. One evening, when I complained about how long it was taking, she looked up from her laptop and said, "Build it with purpose, not revenge." Those words stayed with me. They forced me to ask why I was doing this, to prove something to my parents or to prove something to myself. By late August, we prepared for the launch. I uploaded the first public version of HomeEase to the App Store, unsure if anyone would notice. I watched the numbers climb slowly, one download at a time. The first review appeared from a woman in Denver. "This app saved my weekend." Then another came from Seattle, then Chicago, and within weeks it spread faster than I could track. People were using it to find plumbers, electricians, and handymen in minutes instead of hours. The system wasn't perfect, but it worked. The nights grew longer, the work heavier, yet I didn't feel tired. I felt alive in a way I hadn't since leaving home. For the first time, I wasn't surviving, I was creating. 3 months later, HomeEase reached 10,000 active users. The number didn't feel real until I saw an article on a local tech website with my photo under the headline, "Self-Taught Visionary from Boulder Redefines Home Services." I stared at the screen, unable to move. Alan called that night to congratulate me. "You've done something remarkable," he said. I thanked him, though the words felt small compared to the gratitude inside me. After we hung up, I sat in the dark office, the city lights flickering outside, thinking about the girl who had left her parents' house with a single suitcase. She would never have believed that the world would one day listen. By the time I turned 28, my app was everywhere. HomeEase had grown from a quiet experiment into a full-scale company with an office overlooking downtown Boulder. Our team was young, ambitious, and full of ideas that never seemed to sleep. I had traded my old laptop for a proper workspace filled with the soft buzz of computers and the smell of strong coffee that reminded me of my barista days. Sometimes I still arrived before sunrise, watching the light pour across the city, thinking about how something so small had built a life I never expected. The company expanded faster than I could keep up with. We hired developers, designers, and marketing specialists, all of them younger and sharper than I had been when I started. They spoke in a rhythm that blended optimism with exhaustion. Each week we hit new milestones, partnerships with repair chains, collaborations with universities, even an initiative that provided free home services for single parents. Watching the platform evolve was like seeing a living thing grow stronger with each heartbeat. One morning, I received an invitation to speak at a technology conference in San Francisco. It felt unreal. I had once written code alone in a rented apartment, afraid to hope too much, and now I was being asked to share my story on a stage filled with industry leaders. Standing before that crowd, I talked about failure, persistence, and how purpose often hides inside rejection. The applause afterward was warm, but what stayed with me most were the quiet nods of people who seemed to understand. That same year, my Aunt Diane decided to retire. She said she wanted to travel before her knees started to complain. We had lunch together at the same cafe where I once poured coffee for strangers. She laughed as I told her about our new office, the investors, and the endless meetings. Before we parted, I handed her an envelope containing documents transferring a share of the company to her name. She protested at first, but I told her, "You gave me my first desk. You deserve this more than anyone." Her eyes glistened with pride, and for the first time I realized how much of my courage had come from her. But success rarely exists in isolation. One afternoon, a news alert flashed across my phone: Quinn and Associates under investigation for financial misconduct. I stared at the headline, feeling the strange mix of disbelief and inevitability. My father, the man who once defined success in our family, was now being questioned by authorities. The firm that had stood for decades was collapsing under its own ambition. Lydia had taken over part of the firm's operations after law school, and according to the reports, she was struggling to contain the fallout. For days, I tried not to think about it. The logical part of me said it wasn't my problem. Yet at night, I caught myself wondering how it must feel for them, the silence around the dinner table, the sharpness of regret filling the air. I thought about the way Dad used to speak with absolute certainty, and how certainty could crumble faster than trust. Then one evening, while reviewing reports in my office, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a familiar name. It was Mom. I hesitated before answering. Her voice was soft, careful, as if she were afraid I might hang up. "Riley," she said, "your father wants to talk." For a long moment, I said nothing. Outside the window, the city lights flickered like distant memories. The office was quiet, except for the faint hum of machines. I could almost hear my father's voice in the silence, the way it used to sound when he told me what I couldn't do. But this time, the power had shifted. I wasn't the child seeking approval anymore. I was someone who had built her own world from nothing. I took a deep breath and said, "Tell him I'll call tomorrow." When I saw their names flash on my phone, I already knew. There was a heaviness in my chest before I even answered. My assistant had told me earlier that some people were waiting in the lobby, but she hadn't said who. The moment I walked toward the glass door and saw Richard's posture rigid, proud, pretending control he no longer had, I understood that this day was inevitable. Mom stood beside him, her expression soft but rehearsed, and Lydia lingered a step behind them, holding a handbag she kept tightening her grip on. I led them into the conference room. It was quiet except for the low hum of the city outside. None of them spoke at first. Richard glanced around the polished table, the walls of glass, the company logo behind me. It wasn't admiration I saw in his eyes, but calculation, as if he were assessing the value of everything in the room, including me. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "We came to talk about the company." His voice still carried that courtroom weight, though it trembled faintly beneath the surface. Mom looked at him before adding, "You've done so well, Riley. We're proud of you." I didn't respond. The silence stretched, and Richard continued. "Your mother and I think it's only right that we receive our share. After all we raised, you supported, you gave you the foundation to succeed." I looked at him carefully. "You want money? We want fairness," he said. 50%. You wouldn't have become who you are without us. It's not about greed. It's about what's fair." For a moment, I felt the familiar chill of the girl who once stood outside his office door waiting to be heard. But that girl was gone. I sat back and let the words echo in the room before answering. "Do you remember what you told me when I left home? You said, 'If you walk away from law, don't expect anything from me.' You gave me nothing." Remember? Richard's jaw tightened and Mom reached across the table, her tone almost pleading. "Riley, we just want to fix things. To make it fair again." "Fair," I repeated quietly. Fair would have been believing in me when I needed it. Fair would have been letting me exist without earning it. No one spoke. The weight of the past hung between us. Lydia kept her gaze lowered, tracing invisible circles on the table with her finger. When I looked at her, she finally raised her head. There was something raw in her eyes, envy wrapped in regret. She whispered I didn't know it would come to this. I nodded. Neither did I. But it did. Richard exhaled sharply as if the air itself betrayed him. You're ungrateful, he said. After everything we've done for you. I smiled faintly, though it wasn't out of joy. Maybe gratitude looks different when you build yourself from nothing. He pushed back his chair, the sound scraping against the floor like an old argument resurfacing. Mom stood beside him, eyes glistening. Lydia hesitated, then followed. None of them said goodbye. They walked out of the conference room, their reflections fading across the glass walls as the door closed. For a long time I stood there alone. The skyline shimmered beyond the window, a mosaic of gold and blue lights scattered across the horizon. Their voices still lingered faintly in the air, tangled with the sound of traffic below. I thought of everything they had taken from me and everything they could no longer touch. I didn't feel anger anymore, only distance. The kind that comes not from hatred but from clarity. They had built walls out of expectations, and I had built a life beyond them. 2 days later, they came back, this time with a lawyer. The security at the front desk called before sending them up, their voices low and uncertain. I told them to let them in. When the elevator doors opened, Richard stepped out first, wearing the same suit he had probably kept for moments of control. Mom followed, her face pale under the office lights, and Lydia stood slightly behind, looking more like a shadow than a person. Beside them was a man in a dark gray jacket carrying a briefcase polished to perfection. He introduced himself as their attorney, said his name quickly as if it didn't matter. He handed me an envelope, heavy and deliberate, its edges sealed with formality. They're filing a claim, he said, seeking financial restitution and partial ownership of HomeEase. I listened quietly. The words sounded rehearsed, stripped of any emotion, but every syllable hit with a strange weight. Richard looked directly at me. You could make this easier for everyone. Just agree to a settlement. It's not worth the fight. I folded the envelope without opening it. You've already made it worth the fight, I said. The lawyer cleared his throat and added something about parental contributions, moral equity, family rights. None of it mattered. They were trying to rewrite a story that had already been finished. 3 months later, the court dismissed the case entirely. The ruling was clear: no legal grounds, no entitlement, no claim. I didn't attend the hearing. My legal team sent me the verdict by email, a few lines that closed a chapter years in the making. But the real verdict had been written long before. In every moment I was told I wasn't enough. Richard sold the family house soon after to pay his debts. The once grand property on Willow Creek was stripped of its furniture, its chandeliers packed in silence. Neighbors whispered about how the Quinns had fallen, though no one ever said it to their faces. Mom disappeared from social circles, her charity friends finding new people to photograph. Lydia's name appeared in the papers months later when the state bar suspended her license. The report said she had falsified tax documents while managing a client's account. She never called me, and I never reached out. There was nothing left between us but the echo of choices. One morning, while walking past downtown, I stopped in front of an old building that had once belonged to Quinn and Associates. The plaque with the family name was still faintly visible beneath the dust. I stood there for a long time, remembering the days I used to wait in its lobby, trying to feel small enough to be accepted. Then I bought the building. Not as a trophy, but as a reclamation. Months later, after months of renovation, the space reopened as the HomeEase Learning Center, a training hub for young developers who couldn't afford college tuition. The walls were painted white, the air smelled of new computers and hope. During the opening ceremony, I walked onto the small stage. The crowd was quiet, expectant. I took a breath and looked at the screen behind me where our first group of students had gathered, smiling nervously at the future they were about to build. I said, "Some things you build from nothing, that's the point." The room was silent for a moment, then the applause rose soft, but certain, like the sound of closure itself. Afterward, as the lights dimmed and the guests left, I walked through the empty halls. The glass walls reflected my own face, older, steadier, no longer seeking approval. Outside, the city glowed against the night, and for the first time in years, it felt like home. A year later, I drove past the old house one last time. The gate leaned sideways, paint peeling like memory itself. The windows were dark curtains, gone ivy curling around the frame, as if the house was trying to hide its own past. For a long moment, I sat in the car watching how time had quietly erased what used to feel unchangeable. There were no voices, no music, only the whisper of wind moving through the broken porch railings. I didn't stop. Some doors no longer need to be reopened. That evening, I visited Aunt Diane. She had retired to a small cottage outside Boulder, a place filled with books, mismatched teacups, and the soft hum of an old radio. We cooked together, laughing about the chaos of early days when I was still learning how to code and burn toast at the same time. She told me she had always known I would build something that mattered, not because of spite, but because of purpose. When I got home that night, my inbox was filled with articles and messages. One headline read, "From Disinherited to Industry Leader." I stared at it for a while, thinking about how strange it felt to be summarized in a sentence. Success had stopped feeling like revenge a long time ago. It had become something quieter, steadier. A kind of peace I didn't need to explain. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from Lydia. The handwriting was careful, as if she had rewritten it many times before sending. She apologized for everything said. She finally understood what I had gone through. I read it once and folded it neatly back into the envelope. Some apologies are meant to be accepted in silence. That night, I opened my laptop to check the last update on the new HomeEase feature. The screen glowed faintly in the dark room. As the final line of code compiled, the words appeared at the top of the screen, "Built from nothing." I smiled, closed the laptop, and let the light fade into stillness. No one can take away your true worth unless you give them that power. Recognition comes when you stop chasing it from others and start creating it yourself. When they say you get nothing, it isn't always a curse. Sometimes it's the beginning of everything. Because starting from nothing doesn't mean you have less. It means you have the freedom to define what everything really means. Thank you for listening until the very end of my story. If you've ever chosen a path no one believed in, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Maybe your story will be the reason someone else keeps going when it feels impossible. Because sometimes all it takes is one story to remind us why we started believing in ourselves.